Hello and welcome to South East Rivers Trust's series of webinars, The Story of Rivers. The South East Rivers Trust is a grassroots environmental charity aiming to bring rivers back to life across the southeast of England. We'll be sharing this series via our YouTube channel, but also via the Sur River Club Facebook page, where there's lots of other content for you to enjoy. So if you haven't already joined, head over there and see what you've missed so far. If you'd like to ask a question at any point during or after the webinar, you can post it in the comment section below. This will help us know what to include in future webinars, and you can also try we can also try some question and answer sessions with a panel of our expert staff, which will allow us to dig a bit deeper into some of the subjects. Your presenting team today are Toby and Nick, so I'll hand over to them to introduce themselves.
Hi, as a brief intro, my name's Toby Hull. I'm Head of Operations at the South East Rivers Trust. After basically studying fish at uni, I worked as a contractor delivering river-related construction projects. I've now been at the Trust for coming up to 8 years as part of the delivery team, and we focus on implementing physical delivery on the ground.
Hi, I'm Nick Hale. I'm Project Officer at the Trust, focusing on physical delivery and site management projects. I've been working and volunteering on environmental construction projects for the last 10 years in the UK, US, and New Zealand.
So today what we're going to do is look at what natural processes are, why there's the need to restore them, and how we go about doing it. Incredibly simplistically, natural processes are rivers being rivers and doing what rivers do. I do need to caveat that with a statement with some small print. Essentially, the natural processes are governed by the laws of physics, specifically fluid dynamics, and influenced by geology, with a bit of a splashing of biology thrown in. These all come together under the banner of hydrogeomorphology morphology. Basically, the form and function of the river is influenced by the gradual change of the physical environmental conditions. Also, second caveat, there will be many sweeping generalizations and rules of thumb used throughout this talk. So, generally speaking, rivers start their journey in the steep headwaters, with the gradient gradually shallowing off through the mid-reaches to the point where it's pretty much level, flowing through the estuary and out onto sea, as this curve kind of broadly demonstrates. Now, we're all familiar with the fact that rivers flow with water, but just as importantly is the flow of sediment. And this is often overlooked. It's kind of the invisible, certainly kind of subtle process that occurs. The extent to which it will happen will vary massively compared to the type of river. For instance, there won't be a great deal on chalk streams compared to mountainous spate rivers, but it does occur in all systems. This diagram is known as the Hjulström curve. This is the science bit. Because the water is flowing under the force of gravity, and I think Newton and his laws, the steeper the landscape, the faster the velocity, which in turn means the more energy it has. That's energy to erode and mold the surface of the earth. This erosion section is shown in the green. Once the particle is eroded, it requires much less energy to transport it down the system, at which point the velocity reduces so much that the particle is deposited, shown here by the blue. The other key consideration is the size and density of the particle being moved. For instance, it's going to require a lot less energy to keep a tiny clay particle held in suspension than it would do a granite boulder kind of bouncing and rolling along the stream bed. So back to the curve representing the catchment. This shows that most erosion will generally speaking occur in the uplands. The sediment is transported down through the middle reaches where it becomes deposited in, say, the wide sweeping floodplains, estuary or delta, or even swept out to sea, never to be seen again. But having said this, erosion, transportation and deposition will occur throughout all the length of the river. Localized variations in velocity and geology will influence these processes. Now, we all associate rivers with meanders. All flowing water will want to meander. The geometry of these is a complex mix of the science influenced by a range of physical conditions and underlying fluid dynamics. I'm not even going to pretend to understand all of these, and definitely not the maths behind it, but I can relate these to what we see and experience on the land. Fluid dynamics basically result in faster flowing water on the outside of the bend. This means that over time the banks are eroded, or cut. It can be slowly, as single grains being released, or in sudden bank collapses, which provide sudden significant amount of material or sediment, as us river geeks refer to it, into the system. The rate that this occurs depends on various factors, including the ability for the river to remove the slump material from the toe of the bank. The sediment then starts its journey. It may only make it to the next bend in the short term. Where there is high velocity on the outside of the bend, the opposite is true on the inside. With slower flows, the sediment becomes deposited, forming a feature known as a point bar, as seen here with the lighter patches, which have not yet become vegetated. The same principles also work on a more local scale. For instance, say where a tree falls into the river. As water rushes over, past and through, we get greater velocities, which as a result scales out a pool. Where velocities are reduced behind the tree, the eroded gravels drop out to form a riffle feature. There are other principles associated with this, such as water flowing off perpendicular to an obstacle, such as a fallen tree, but we'll come on to this. Where trees are larger, when banks are soft, this can kickstart a meandering process. This beautiful image shows natural processes really at play. It's a LiDAR image showing the migration of a river over approximately 1,500 years. This shows that rivers are highly dynamic systems, far from the static and clearly defined features that we often perceive them to be. The river migrates both laterally, that's side to side, and longitudinally, due to the continued process of erosion on the outside of bends and deposition on the insides, as well as the other local influences. With this dynamism comes a wide array of benefits, such as diverse, rich habitats. There'll be, say, fine and coarse substrates working down cells down the system, with loads of wooden features such as fallen trees and log jams. There'll be plenty of pools, riffles and bars, and there'll be kind of complete connectivity between the river and the floodplain. There'll be lots of nutrient recycling going on, and there'll be a complex mosaic of food webs and life cycles all being present.
So, in contrast to the previous image of a natural system, this is what we've been up to. Humans have been modifying rivers for thousands of years, and our ambitions have been massive, as you can see from this image of the iconic meander in the River Thames. We saw this posted on Twitter by one of our colleagues at a neighbouring river trust. We don't know much about what the designers were proposing, but it looks like the plan was to cut a lovely straight channel and use the meanders as docks. Luckily, this scheme never got off the ground, but it's good, gives you a good idea of the scale of our ambitions to control the natural world. We've picked out a few more human activities for the next few slides that have more impacts on natural processes. Why have we modified rivers? Here are a few key reasons. Land drainage has been used to increase the productivity of land, or to bring areas of land into cultivation that were previously too wet. Generally, to meet the demand for food from increasing populations, the creation of ditch networks and field drains lowers the water table. The water ends up in the rivers much more quickly than if it was slowly infiltrating through the soil. This can result in increased periods of flood or drought. So now thinking about our industrial legacy. So our use of water mills was fairly small scale until the 18th century, when demand for water power during the Industrial Revolution massively increased. Our own River Wandle had as many as 90 mills over its 9-mile length, and it's thought to have been one of the hardest working rivers of its size at that point in time. High populations and increasing development have created huge areas of impermeable surfaces like concrete, tarmac, and they all really efficiently drain all the water into our rivers and streams. In some cases, we've completely moved or straightened and constrained the river channels with hard revetments like sheet piling and concrete, as in the photo of the Hogs Mill going through Kingston in southwest London. So some of our previous activities has resulted in a higher frequency of flood events in areas that were previously undeveloped. So we've therefore developed a range of flood management systems, some of which have had even more impacts on natural processes. So yeah, in some regions, we've dredged our river channels to increase the capacity of the channel to move water downstream. Now, this is a very highly political subject, as seen in the flooding experienced in Somerset a few years back. Now, there is no doubt that dredging further disconnects the river from its floodplains, which would normally help to dissipate the energy. So instead, this can actually increase flood risk downstream. So let's have a look at an example of a heavily modified channel that's gone through numerous periods of alteration. So, reference, this is the Beverley Brook in South London. And so you can see by 1865, some of the channel's been straightened with some of the meandering profile left in place below. And looking over to the next photo on the right, by 1948, the section had been moved and straightened, and you can see the original tree line of the banks still in place. Interestingly, upstream, someone might have felt a bit of guilt and had to go at some more re-wiggling. So you can see on the photo on the right, there's actually a golf course, so this might have had something to do with it, at least at some point in this period. So finally, this LiDAR image shows various different colours, and these different colours indicate the differences in elevation. And you can see that this channel running through the middle is much deeper than the surrounding land, and it shows just how disconnected the modified channel is from its floodplain. So this is what that modified stretch looks like on the ground. It's very incised, it's deep channel, which is completely disconnected from its surrounding landscape. It's very straight, and there's little to no marginal habitat or vegetation. The channel's also over wide, and this means that the water's got less energy to do what it wants to do, and it's resulted in lots of sand just completely smothering the bed. The bed's just completely flat, and so without any wood or other things, the variation in depth and width is just non-existent. So it's essentially a desert. So you'll see some of the techniques we use to restore natural processes, and therefore the overall health of the river in some of the later slides. Right, going on to some other common features of heavily modified channels. So one of which is the presence of weirs, which historically have been installed for a range of reasons. So this is a great illustration by the Wild Trout Trust and shows some of the negative impacts that a weir can have on natural processes. So the barrier generally raises the upstream water levels, which we describe as an impoundment, and this drowns out the natural diversity of the riverbed, which is illustrated in the unimpounded section just downstream. So this slows the water velocities and very uniform flows, which just reduces the river's energy and results in deposition of sediments, which can often have high concentrations of nutrients in rural areas and other pollutants in urban areas. So this blocking of the sediment transport system can lead to the river downstream being starved of gravels, and one of the greatest impacts is actually on habitat diversity. So overall, the result is a change in habitat type that generally has a lower biodiversity value. So this is a section of river upstream of a weir on the River Darrant in Kent, and shows just how bad things can get when weirs prevent sediment moving downstream. So in this instance, the river's been temporarily dammed off and the channel drained to allow restoration work to continue. As you can see, the silt's around knee depth for the whole of the stretch, equating to thousands of cubic meters of material. We've since used this accumulated silt in combination with lots of other techniques, which we'll describe later, to restore the channel to a more natural condition.
The term restoring or restoration even the correct one to use. This implies that we're looking to take it back, in which case, what is the baseline that we're wanting to take it back to? Is it a time and condition pre-industrial revolution, pre-ice age or even pre-human? And how do you go about deciding? If taken literally, most of the time restoration is either a purist view or is simply unachievable. We cannot set the clock back and pretend that human influence on the environment ever happened. It's simply been too great and is often irreversible, both on the physical and ecological worlds. Therefore, rehabilitating is probably the most accurate reflection of what we're doing in most cases. We're working to either slow or reverse the degradation of the natural world, kind of aiming to achieve healthy and more sustainable ecosystems in the face of ongoing and increasing human presence. But having said all of that about rehabilitating rivers, the term restoration is without doubt the common and accepted phrase for what we do. So we'll continue to use that from this point on. I will also add at this point, we are able to restore some natural processes in order to help rehabilitate river systems. Now, with the restoration, there's a real balance that needs to be met. This will depend not only on the demand of the land, but also by the financial ability to cover the cost of such schemes, the social acceptance of the proposed, and by what top-down influence there may be. When it comes to what is physically possible here in the southeast of England, which has been so heavily impacted by human influence, we're generally far more constrained with what we're able to do, as opposed to in, say, Scotland or, say, the remote areas of the States or Canada. This is the River Restoration Balancing Act. Now, our work is directed at a catchment and ecosystem-based approach to restoring rivers and their catchments. Essentially, we try to work with nature and physical processes wherever we can, as opposed to fighting it. This is generally a more diverse, flexible, and sustainable approach. There's a nice relationship here. By us restoring natural processes in turn help to restore a more naturally functioning and varied physical environment, which in turn promotes a richer, more sustainable and diverse ecosystem. We're quite often releasing the river from its shackles, putting in some basic building blocks, which enables the river to self-heal. Nature is resilient and given the opportunity will bounce back. So what we're going to do now is run through some examples of projects that we've carried out where we've sought to restore natural processes.
So this is an example of a weir removal we did on the Lesser Tees in Kent. And when we've got a project to restore a stretch of river impounded by a weir, the best option for kickstarting natural processes is always to remove the weir completely. However, sometimes this isn't possible, and we'll discuss these other options more in another webinar. So the photo on the left shows the impounded channel directly upstream of the weir just before it was removed. You can see it looks more like with very little diversity in features and in types of flow. The photo on the right was taken in the days after the weir had been removed. It's easy to see the features that have been exposed, and more importantly, the river's regained its energy by having a much more natural gradient. So I remember standing on this section of channel directly after the weir was removed, and you could actually hear and feel the gravels beneath your feet being mobilized downstream, which is great. So this video was taken in spring 2017, downstream of the Weir site, about 5 months after removal. You can see large numbers of chub were seen spawning on these clean, well-oxygenated gravels, which were previously locked up behind the Weir. So this is a really good illustration of how important it is to kind of remove these obstructions and get that sediment transport system going. Right, we've got another example of weir removal on the River Wandle at Hackbridge, and this is one of my favourite projects I've worked on for the Trust. You can see on the right hand side we've got a weir which was creating an impoundment, which is shown on the left hand side, and yeah, we've got a deposition of, again, knee-high silt, which you can see here in the smaller photo. So after locking up all this nasty silt by narrowing the channel with a variety of techniques, and we've imported some extra gravel and planted thousands of native marginal plants with a group of volunteers. And this is the same stretch just over 5 years later on, looking lovely, clean, healthy. The weir actually used to go across this section in the foreground. So yeah, we've got nice clean gravels, lush growth of marginal and aquatic plant species, which shows that we got the dimension of the channel just right.
One technique commonly used to restore modified channels is the river restorer's beloved brash berms. We can use the principles of natural processes in our favour with them. Brash is basically branches, twigs and treetops which we fix securely in place in the channel. We use them to narrow the channel to more appropriate size for what the flows are compared to the drains that we converted the rivers into. They add sinuosity, which kicks the flow around, which therefore creates a diversity of flow types and bed features. They then establish into lush marginal vegetation, which can be so frequently lacking in modified systems and which is so critical to biodiversity. Just to illustrate how brash berms work, I'm going to show you a series of photos of the same constructed berm over a 2-year period. Firstly, the brash berm is constructed. This creates a dense network of branches, twigs and leaves, which increases roughness, which in turn slows the flow of water. The reduced velocities encourage sediment and seeds to become deposited, and then the first pioneer vegetation species starts to establish. Then full establishment, which then kind of snowballs the process by slowing the velocity more through the vegetation, and so it goes on. And I don't actually have a more up-to-date photo, but this berm is now, given a bit more time, is really foaming up into kind of proper bankside feature. On the other side, by narrowing the actively flowing channel, the velocity here increases and therefore so does the energy. This erodes and transports the finer silt and sand material, which often smothers the gravel bed beneath, which is a consequence of lots of anthropogenic influences. Now, these gravel beds benefit a range of invertebrates and fish species, such as this monster bullhead, which we found on one of our restored sections recently. These are the before and after photos taken at a project we did at Richmond Park, pretty much at the same spot over a 3-year period. We have instigated and restored some natural processes, which in turn have kick-started the recovery of the river. From us narrowing the channel using a combination of brash and faggots backfilled with material from the regraded banks, as well as installing plenty of large wooden material to restore energy, the river has since adapted and continues to evolve. The diversity in habitat and flow types is clear to the eye, but we've also demonstrated this in biological monitoring with a greater abundance and diversity in invertebrate and plant communities. And anecdotally, we witnessed an absolutely huge increase in fish populations, which unfortunately, just before we did the follow-up survey, were wiped out by an absolutely massive fish kill on the river. This image shows pretty much the same stretch, but from the aerial view over the same time period. As you can hopefully see from the view, there's so much more complexity within the channel. In place of the uniform channel on the left, on the right there's a sinuous channel form with differing channel widths and so much more marginal and bankside vegetation going on. I've got to say the variety of depths and habitats really is best experienced walking up the channel with a pair of waders on. This is the Beverley Brook through Wimbledon Common, which really demonstrates the issue of reinforced banks. Here, kilometres of toe boarding was historically installed to help keep the river in a literal straitjacket, as you can see from the photos of the long and artificially straight channel. With a middle photo located on a bend, this is where you would expect erosion and some lateral migration through the cut bank process to occur. However, as previously covered, a factor that controls the rate that this happens is the ability for the river to move the slump material, which is at the toe of the bank, which is the weak spot. This toe boarding artificially retains this material and therefore prevents further erosion. As you can see, the banks are absolutely stacked full of gravel, but unfortunately the riverbed is covered in sand. So as part of a recent project, we removed approximately about 2 linear kilometres of creosoted toe boarding by us unconstraining the river from its straitjacket, and with a few other prompts such as plenty of wood and channel narrowing, we have helped enable the river to once again do its thing with natural processes. This is another project on the Hogs Mill. here it's rather than us removing toe border banks, it was about 200 tons of concrete encapsulating both the bed and banks. Once gone, we installed a narrowed low flow channel, we graded the high vertical banks and naturalised the area. And this is another job that we're currently working up, and it's a big one. It's about 150 metres of fully concrete channel. So yeah, very much in the development stage, but watch this space for how we get on.
So now we're going to talk about a bit more in detail about how we can use trees and vegetation to restore natural processes. So this is another great illustration from the Wild Trout Trust, showing a range of different techniques that you can use woody material to restore natural processes. So you'll notice a lot of the features we've already talked about, like deposition on the inside bends, erosion on the outside bends, the meander, and this evolution of pools and riffles. Again, these are mimicking the natural processes of a tree naturally falling into the river and settling into position. So you can see that the wood can be pointed in all sorts of directions, so upstream facing, downstream facing. So it's important to use all of these different techniques and consider them all when we're doing a project to restore a channel. So on the left is another photo we showed you previously of a naturally fallen tree with lovely pool and riffle sequences. So that's the natural side. On the right hand side, we've been able to replicate the same type of features as part of a restoration along a heavily modified channel. Again, you can see these lovely green gravels transitioning to the deeper pools and then back into another riffle. So we've got this pool riffle sequence evolving continuously. So in some situations, there may be too little tree cover, or going back to our project on the River Darren, sometimes too much. So as Toby said earlier on, it's about finding the balance. So in this case, we needed to get some more light back along the restored river channel, which was going to boost the growth of the marginal and aquatic plants that we've put in. So we undertook some essential but sympathetic tree works. So the root plates and all the other pieces of wood were amazing materials to kickstart these natural processes we've been talking about. Here's a couple of examples now. I mean, I remember going fishing as a kid, and I always found that most of my success was fishing in and around these fallen trees and root structures. So it's important to remember that fish do live in trees too. We've got some more examples here of structures we installed, and these are all going to create diversity in the way that water flows through the channel, promote erosion and deposition, and also some lovely hiding places for fish and other wildlife to feel at home. Just going back, remember the water had been dammed off upstream at this point, so all of these shots here and the structures will eventually be underwater. So it's really important that woody material isn't removed from rivers if it isn't causing a problem. So ideally they'd be left alone, or if needed, we could come along and secure them in place. So the other thing is making sure that we've got these woody habitats going to be around in the future. So planting trees and other plants is really a key part of the whole system of restoring the landscape. So finally, on the exciting subject of natural flood management, which proves leaving wood in the channel can actually help to reduce the impacts of flooding. But we'll leave that for another time.
Okay, thanks guys. Just one last reminder that if there's anything more you'd like to know about the subjects we've covered, then please leave your comments below. Next time on the Story of Rivers, we'll be exploring the issue of sewage in rivers, the effect that this pollution has on people and wildlife, and what we can all do to help. So we hope you enjoyed this instalment of the Story of Rivers. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll talk to you all again soon.